my name is Evelyn Flanagan. I'm the research manager here in the Mercy University Hospital in Cork and the lead scientist in the CRF ECC, and I'll be looking after you for this session. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to take a look at rating scales for dementia studies. We're going to have a look at data management principles and best practices, and then we're going to finish off by looking at the reporting requirements, particularly around regulated studies. So we'll take a look first maybe at the role of rating scales in dementia trials in general. And if we think about the purpose of the assessment scale, the purpose of the assessment scale in general really is to increase, we'd say, the precision of a decision by reducing the subjectivity and increasing the objectivity. So in a clinical trial setting, then researchers have kind of identified a series of sensitive scales and tests in order to develop a kind of more complex picture of how potential treatments may affect a person's life across various different areas. And really the essential role of rating scales in dementia trials really lies in their ability to significantly enhance the accuracy and the efficacy of evaluating interventions through a number of different mechanisms. So it could be that the scales themselves, would say, provide a standardized framework for assessing the diverse range of symptoms associated with dementia. They themselves again provide objectivity, so the scales themselves in clinical trials can achieve a more kind of objective and consistent assessment of a patient's condition. So that standardization then reduces the subjectivity in evaluations, and then that allows you for more reliable data collection, again making it easier to track treatment effects accurately. Of course, another component of them is their sensitivity to changes. So the scales themselves offer the ability to detect even kind of more subtle changes in a patient's condition over time. They're also very important for comparative analysis. So again, using similar types of scales or consistent scales across different trials or interventions allows for that comparative analysis. And of course, whenever we try to standardize something in terms of data, we get an improvement in data quality and interpretation. So that standardization again in the scales contribute to a more enhanced quality and reliability of the collected data itself. Another important component of the assessment scales themselves is achieving the trial objectives, which is clearly a very important thing. So the selection again of the appropriate rating scales aligns with kind of more the specific objectives of the clinical trials themselves. So overall, really, the use of rating scales significantly improves the accuracy, we say, the reliability and the efficiency of evaluating interventions in dementia trials by providing, we say, a standardized, objective and quantifiable measure associated with the condition. So the standardized measurement and data collection are really pivotal in advancing an understanding of treatments and interventions in dementia. Now, as we mentioned in the previous slide, we know that dementia clinical trials has various types of rating scales are utilised really to measure and assess different aspects of the condition. So again, the scales themselves can help, quantify the severity of the symptoms and certainly are involved in tracking changes over time. And you can see some of the more common ones there on the left, and needless to say, some of them would be more involved in cognitive assessment scales, some of them are involved in functional assessment scales, behavioural or psychiatric symptom scales, quality of life scales, or things like global assessment scales like the CDR. So the scales again cover different types of domains, so that would be including things like cognitive function, activities of daily living, behavioural symptoms, quality of life, and really the overall assessment, we'd say, of the severity of dementia. So really it's often a combination of the scales is used to provide a kind of more comprehensive evaluation of various symptoms and their changes over the time in clinical trials. And really the selection of the specific scales depends on the trial's objectives and the characteristics of the patient population under study. Now we're not going to go through the ins and outs of what the different scales represents and the best practice associated with delivering them, but just to be aware that the DTI do support training in various different scales, so keep an eye out on training events that the DTI may have, and certainly being able to show that you have experience in delivering these scales is important from a clinical trials point of view. So what do we mean by ratio experience requirements? So the sponsor themselves will actually determine the experience required to deliver some of the scales. They'll usually actually have a third-party vendor that might be involved in evaluating someone's experience with the scales themselves. So if we just take an example there of the CDR, the ADAS-Cog and the R-band. So for the CDR, and again, this will change according to various different studies and according to the sponsor. But for the CDR, we'll say, for example, the educational background required for someone to deliver the scale itself would be either doctoral, master's degree, registered nurse or equivalent, and they would have to have 2 to 3 years experience, and between 5 and 10, we'll say, number of administrations of the rating tool itself in the past 12 months. And for R-bands or the ADAS-Cog, then you'd have the doctoral level master's, registered nurse or equivalent, about 1 year's experience with dementia patients, and the delivery of 10 or more of those in the previous 12 months. So another consideration then for sites really is the setup of the raters. So again, this is just a general example, but we'll say if there was a CDR scale involved and other clinical scales. So ideally you would have a primary clinical rater, and then you would have a backup of that rater, so they would be able to do all the clinical scales except the CDR. And then you would have a CDR rater, we'll say, and a backup of those. So I suppose the important message here is that sites could or need available 4 raters for any particular study, dependent on the types of scales that are involved. Just to give you kind of an idea of the overall process flow involved in rater qualification, and again, this might be changed slightly depending on the sponsor or just depending on the study itself. But in general, we have a thing called a rater identification form, which would be sent to the sponsor outlining who we think should be involved in the ratings. The sponsor themselves then will send an individual questionnaire to those people outlining their experience. Then that will be reviewed. It's usually reviewed by an external party, and they will have a minimum experience requirements, and that will be very clearly defined in their qualification methodology. There may be further training and qualification required, even if you are a very experienced person in ratings, to meet the standards required for the sponsor, and that's usually given online via virtual platform. And once that's complete, then you get a kind of report that says you're qualified to conduct the rating scales, and then that would be added to your site file for review. So again, it does take a specific amount of time to go through that process to allow for that process to happen. So it may affect your timings in terms of your green light before you can start recruitment. So just a few more considerations when you're doing the rating scales in the clinical trial. So again, the cognitive test results can really greatly be impacted by improper administration, and that will really create unwanted variance. So again, that training and experience is vital for the studies themselves. So again, it's very important to minimize both the intra and the inter-rater variability in the test administration during the research study. So again, the tests have to be administered according to instructions in the same way across the patients and across time, to minimize those errors and variance and keep that inter and intra reliability as high as possible. So again, in general, in research that involves neurocognitive endpoints, even if you are very experienced raters and you have very experienced raters in your team, you are often routinely required to complete rater training to meet the goals of the specific sponsor needs. So just a quick note again on the testing environment itself for the scales. So again, it could take anything from a half an hour to 3 hours depending on the number of scales administered per visit. So again, do you have access to a quiet and comfortable room that you can utilize for the duration of the study visit or the duration of the study itself? And again, eliminating all those possible distractions, ensuring that clocks, calendars, etc. are moved and covered up. Just a couple of more considerations. Really, as I said, training will be required by the sponsor for the study, and approval will be required before the study starts. So you will need to go through that approval process in order to get the green light to recruit your patients. So again, experience in the scales is absolutely essential, and just to keep an eye out again for DTI training events around rating scales. As we mentioned as well, you will need a specific number of raters or backup raters that are required, and usually it's the same rater for the duration of the study if possible. And again, you may need, we'd say, blinded raters, and again, they're crucial for reducing, we'd say, the bias in the evaluation of the outcomes themselves and ensuring and maintaining the integrity of the study itself by minimizing the potential for unintentional bias in the evaluation of the outcomes. So again, do we have enough staff on site for that? Another consideration will be the study partner themselves, so they will be required for some of the ratings. So again, we need to consider the burden that might put on the study partner themselves. So we're going to pivot away now from the rating scales and move on to data management. And data management is one of those things that's not really considered to any great extent in terms of clinical trials, but it's one of the more pivotal components of a clinical trial. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on it, and we're going to have a look at it in general, and then we're going to have a look at some of the best practices that we can utilize to ensure our sites are GCP compliant when it comes to data management of our study data. So again, if we're just looking at what research data is, it's not just necessarily the thing that's up on the database, we'll say. So it's general information that's generated, collected, or observed during a research project in general. And the output of that can vary from using, we'll say, different databases, patient leaflets, there could be posters, there could be websites involved, there could be metadata involved, coding involved, and various different guidelines. So the type of research data can vary a lot depending on the type of study we're involved. But it's basically evidence that's used to support a research conclusion, and that may go on then to form part of a scholarly record or an outcome, we'll say, for a clinical trial itself. So in terms of why you'd want to manage your data, there's significant risk obviously associated with not managing your research data effectively. And in general, that can kind of come into two pathways. One would be confused data, we'd say. So that could be arising from a lack of documentation, meaning that you might have to repeat a study because you can't make sense of the results that you've previously undertaken. Or there might be a loss of data. So again, you might not be able to repeat the collection of that data. So we'll say, for example, in a patient visit, if you haven't collected the information, you won't be able to collect it in a later opportunity, and you might lose therefore the potential and opportunity and the impact of not being able to access that information. So again, having good data management practice is important for clinical trials, but in general for research as well. There's a number of different benefits to managing your data. So the first one is that it makes it easier for yourself. You can find the information that you require. You can also verify your results fairly quickly if that's required at some point. And you combine your data then with other data sets, we'll say, or you might be able to combine your data with collaborators at a later point. And it's easier as well for others to find and understand your data for new research, be that if you leave or move on and you're able to utilize your old data, or if you're developing new collaborations with people at a later point. It's also easier for others to cite your data. So again, the data set itself, the coding itself can be another output from your research as well. So in terms of data, again, it's an incredibly valuable asset. We might only see a small portion of it, of the data that's been collected, that would be made visible, we'll say, in terms of a paper that's been published or an outcome of our clinical trial. But there's a massive selection process, reduction and distillation process involved underneath all of that to get to that publishable document. So again, research data is an incredibly invaluable asset, and we need to take the time up front to be able to think about how we can manage our data best. So again, if we look at the overall involvement of data management in clinical trials, and to take a kind of high level look at it, it's involved in the full life cycle of a clinical trial. It's just not something that you're involved with in the end. So data management processes, we'll say, instead of in terms of study setup, we'd say will be the case report form design and development, the database build and testing, and implementing some of those edit checks that can help you with the quality and consistency of your data. Throughout the study then, there will be data entry involved, there will be discrepancy management, again, something that's very important in clinical trials, being able to respond to those queries that the sponsor may have, either automatic queries or from the data management team centrally. And then in terms of study closeout, there's various different quality controls involved, and we need to ensure that all our queries are complete before we lock our database and transfer and archive our information. So data management, again, is something that's involved throughout the life cycle of a clinical trial, and it should be looked at various different time points. So if we take a look at the regulations and guidelines in and around data management for clinical trials, there's quite a few that can kind of help guide us. One of them is GCP, and again, you would be very familiar with that in the clinical trials environment. and the more recent version has a specific section in and around data management, and particularly around some of the technical components of data management, and that's the first time that that has happened in GCP's history. So again, that speaks to the importance of data management in clinical trials. There are some other guidance around that are more technical. Some of them are the 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, which is a United States compliance guidance document, but it does provide specific technical examples, which is quite useful when you're trying to validate, we'll say, a system. And the use of computerized systems for industry, again, EU Annex 11, which is very similar to 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, but it's from an EU perspective, again, giving you kind of more technical specifications around what's required for a regulated study. And then we have a risk-based monitoring, again, a guidance document around central data management for clinical trials. I'm not going to go into all the guidelines and the regulations around data management, but just to mention the GCP one. Again, as I said, it's the first time that there's data governance for the investigator and sponsor included in the GCP document itself. And again, it's looking at those processes that we should have in place in terms of data protection, we'd say, for clinical trial participants, and ensuring confidentiality and GDPR is satisfied. Again, if you're involved in the development of a computerized system or the validation of a computerized system, that you need to ensure that they're fit for purpose and they're used appropriately. So again, have you got the validation documents in place? Have you got the training documents in place? Specific SOPs in and around that. Processes for safeguarding essential elements of the clinical trial itself. So again, the randomization process, if it's an electronic system, have you managed that correctly? Dose escalation, again, have you managed that correctly? And the blinding. And then again, processes for support key decisions. So again, the data finalization prior to the analysis. If unblinding is necessary, do you have a procedure for that? Have you allocation of the analysis data sets or changes in the clinical trial design and how that might affect the data as well? So again, it just outlines and gives some kind of guidelines in and around that. It won't specifically go into the technical specifications as to what's required to be a validated system. It just gives you kind of an outline of those. But again, it's interesting to see that GCP has moved in that direction, again, ensuring the importance of data management throughout the life cycle of the study itself. So what we really want people to do in terms of data management is really to kind of plan ahead to create high quality and sustainability of data long term, and to really ensure that whatever data that we're collecting is clear, it's accurate, and it's concise. And again, be that in a clinical trial or if you're just doing general clinical research, we just need to ensure that we make the data clear and easy to understand and easy to use. And again, have essential SOPs, procedures, and policies in place that if we have a turnover of staff, that people continue to collect the data at the same high quality and the same level throughout the study itself. And the other thing to say around data management is it will actually save money in the long term to spend that bit of time up front thinking about data management throughout the life cycle. So again, just looking at this pie chart, for example, and again, it's from a data science report back in 2016, and they just looked at what data scientists spend most of their time doing. And you can see by that chart there that 60% is spent cleaning and organizing the data itself, rather than mining the data, we'll say, for patterns or refining algorithms, etc., etc. So again, spending that time up front will save significant time towards the end and get you to that outcome faster if you can spend the time up front thinking about the data management and ensuring you get clean, quality data. So I just wanted to put up the data sequence. I'm not going to go through the individual components of it, but I'm just going to highlight one of the two more important components, which is the protocol design and the case report form design. And again, if this was a pharmaceutical study, you would just be presented with the protocol and you would be presented with the electronic case report form. But if you're an academic investigator leading an interventional study or a regulated study, you may be more involved in the protocol design and the case report design. I just wanted to highlight one or two things in the next few slides. So the case report form, or what is the case report form? The case report form is the printed or electronic form used in a study to record the information about the participant as identified by the study protocol. So it's the first document, we say, that translates what's in the protocol into the data that's required, we say, for your outcome. So it allows you to record the data in a manner that's both efficient and accurate. So again, taking the time to design it is very important. And it allows you to record data in a manner that's suitable for processing, analysing and reporting. And again, that will meet the GCP requirements. So in terms of case report form considerations, as I said, it's really the first step in translating your protocol into the data that will get you your main objective, which is the outcome from your studies. So ideally, you'd want to be developing your case report form in parallel, we'll say, to your protocol development. Now, as I've said, if this is a pharmaceutical sponsored study, you would automatically be presented with the protocol complete and an electronic case report form, and you would be given training in around data entry for that electronic case report form. But if you are involved in developing your case report form, then you really do need to start as early as possible and to allow yourself time for drafts, reviews and changes, and it needs to go to various different people in your team to again improve the process or ensure you're getting the data that's required to meet your primary objectives. So again, you're planning ahead with the end in mind and you're working backwards. So what is the desired end product? What is the best way to get there? So in terms of, am I meeting the requirements for my objectives? Am I going with the flow in terms of the process of when the patient comes into the site, etc., etc. Another consideration, we'll say, for the case report form, again, is you should only be collecting the data that's required by the protocol. So no other extraneous data or the just in case kind of data. So if you collect it, you'll have to clean it, you'll have to analyze it, and you'll have to report it. So you should really only be collecting the items that you need to answer the question itself. So in terms of the design of the case report form itself, the case report forms really are only as good as their design. So they have to be easy to use, they have to be clear, and they have to be consistent. And they really need to address the needs of those who will actually be collecting the data. So if at all possible, if you can involve people that are actually collecting the information in the development of the case report form design, you're often better off. So again, that will ensure consistency in terms of the collection with the various different patients and throughout the time points involved in the study itself. Just to give you an idea of the case report form development workflow, so we think we have, or planning a new study, we'll say, we've got a fairly good draft protocol in place. So then we develop our case report form based on standards, and we'll come back to standards there in a while. Then we would modify that case report form based on specific protocols. So again, we might have a certain number of visits and a certain number of tasks that need to be carried out for those visits. You'd send on that case report form then to a number of different people, hopefully in your team and those that are involved in collecting the information. And then once that's done and everyone's happy, you'd have a finalised draft, we'll say, of our case report form. Again, send that out for a cross-functional team review just in case. And then we will have an approved case report form, and then we would be able to utilise that specific case report form in our study, and therefore the overall process would be complete. And that would be cyclical, so you could be going back and forth between cross-functional teams just to review the case report form. So again, we need to be mindful of that and consider it when it comes to specific time frames. A number of key questions when you're designing your case report form, and the first one is the obvious one, is what data is required to be collected. So again, we need to emphasize this: only data that we've specified in our proposal and our protocol, and only data that's required to answer the study question. So then we look at things like, when will the data be collected? Is it a baseline? Are there a number of follow-ups? What forms do we need to be designed? Can we utilize those forms in various different visits? Who is going to be collecting or completing the form again? And are there validated instruments available? And luckily for us within clinical trials, certainly within medicine, there's a number of instruments that are available to us and specific templates and standards around that we can utilize for the development of our case report form. And then again, how is our data going to be analysed? So there may be considerations with our statistician in terms of the export of our information at the end. I'm also going to briefly mention the role of data standards, because as I said previously, there are a number of standards that are available to us that we can utilise to develop our case report forms in terms of templates and in terms of coding for specific data that we want to collect. So again, data standards really just to kind of allow us to increase those efficiencies in performing clinical trials, and certainly if you're involved in multi-site centre studies, then that would ease the collection of information across various different sites. They streamline the data collection at investigator sites. Again, if you can code things, standardize the way information is collected, remove free text, that helps the process along. It also does give higher quality data because of the consistency in the requirements. And it also allows for software development against common standards. So you'd often find, particularly in commercial software, that there would be a specific number of different types of standards in the background, in the architecture and the software, and they would be utilised then when you're collecting your information, which makes, again, the analysis much easier in the end. It also provides long-term means for electronic data archiving and facilitates a review of submissions. There's specific standards, again, that would be used to submit to various different regulatory authorities, and those can be embedded within an electronic system as well. So there are a number of different standards, as I said, available. One very good source is a group called CDISC, and again, that's available for everyone. Just to pop onto their website, and again, you can see what kind of standards they have and what kind of templates they have if you're thinking about developing specific case report forms around certain disease areas. It's very helpful. So again, if you are involved in developing a system, you will be involved in testing the system and validating the system, and I can't overemphasize the length of time that it can take to get a system fully up and running and to go live. So again, there will be a test, retest and retest again process involved. If it's a regulated study, all of that of course would be documented, and you'd have a validated system before you would go live. You can see there are a number of different components involved in the data management lifecycle throughout clinical trial. So we need some kind of a process or document that puts all those various different pieces together, and that would be the data management plan. So if you've been involved in receiving research grants either from the HRB or any European sites, then you will be familiar with the data management plans. They're a mandatory component of most grants nowadays. And really all data management plans do is they pull together what we do in terms of quality for data consistency in our study. They look at data protection and any of the other laws that are applicable, and they look at research integrity and ethics, and they put all of those various different components together in the one document. And it's a live document because, as we know, research may change once we get started, so that document needs to be looked at and updated throughout the life cycle. So data management plans are incredibly important, and they allow you really to make informed decisions or to anticipate or avoid any problems that you may have in terms of maybe integration of a system or training involved in various different components of data entry. So it really helps you to avoid duplication or data loss or security breaches in any way, because it gets you to think about those things in advance. It also allows you to develop procedures early on for consistency, and again, that's very important for one site as it is for multiple sites, ensuring that consistency. And again, we need to ensure that our data is accurate, complete, reliable and secure from a GCP point of view, and again, it will go through those. In the end, it will actually save you time and effort, and it will make your life easier, certainly in terms of consistency and data quality, and again, ensuring that everyone's on the same page when it comes to data management. So data management is being taken seriously, specifically by funders. And so for here in Ireland, we have the HRB, and they have a specific HRB policy on management and sharing of the research data. So if you do receive a grant from the HRB, there's specific components around data management that would need to be adhered to. And again, they would have allowed for that in the budget as well. So again, they do emphasize the data management plan and one component of it, but they also emphasize fair data management, and we'll come back to that term in a while. So again, looking at the data management funders' expectations in the UK, most of the larger funders, if not all of the larger funders, will expect a data management. It will be a core component of the grant application, and it will be a significant portion of the budget as well in terms of data stewardship and fair data management as well. So if we take a look at the data management plan itself, there's just 5 kind of main components or themes in general in the data management plan, and specific funders will have specific objectives which are related to that particular grant. but again, there's kind of 5 main common themes. So the first one would be the kind of description of the data that we're collected. So the content would be, the type, the format that we're collecting, is there a data dictionary, etc. So certain standards then would be a second component, as we've mentioned. What are the methodologies around collecting our information and managing our information, and the short-term storage, we say, for information. Of course, then they will emphasize the ethics and regulations. So what regulations around your data collection, or what rules are you following in terms of ethics for data collection, GDPR, etc. What are our plans for sharing our data? Who has access to the data? So how are you going to share it? When are you going to share it? And who are you going to share it with? And again, it would look to that long-term strategy and preservation of your data, or the reusability of your data as well will come into that plan itself. So again, looking at the data management of a pharmaceutical sponsored study or trial, again, they will provide ECRF for you. So they will provide training for you, and that will be provided to all staff involved in the data entry. There will be role-specific access to various different platforms. So again, you might have just general data entry for clinical information. Certain staff members may need access to lab results, scanning results, the ratings, reporting of adverse events, and training would be provided on all of those platforms. And again, all of that training would need to be completed before you get your green light. So there's no actual one electronic system that will carry out all of those tasks. There are various different commercial software tools available, but again, there's no one fits all for every study, and certainly not one that I've come across that will be able to do all those various different tasks. So some studies will have a practice platform, particularly if it's a study that you're doing as part of a European grant. There may be a validation of a system involved, so you may get to practice on the platform as part of the validation of the system. So again, the important component here is when you're looking at a pharmaceutical sponsored study and you're using an electronic case report form, there will be electronic queries generated on that. Sometimes you need to manually log in to see if there are queries. Other times they will automatically send you an email to alert you to a query. And these queries can be automatically generated from edit checks that the sponsor may have internally into the system, or the sponsor may have a central data management team that can generate those queries as well. And we really try to address those as soon as possible because they don't belong mounting up. And again, all the queries need to be closed out before the database is locked. And again, your monitor will be in contact with the site themselves to ensure that all of that is complete in a timely fashion. I just want to briefly mention 2 other terms that come up a lot in clinical research around data management, and one of those is open data. And open data, or open research data, is data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone. And really, the most that you need to do is credit the curator and share under the same license. And there's a lot of different benefits to open data, and you will see that in and amongst grant funders as well, the request to have as much open data as you possibly can, and obviously there will be restrictions around certain data. But in general, researchers kind of benefit greatly from the discoverability. It's much more efficient in that you can learn from previous data sets and you don't need to reproduce the actual previous studies. So that moves the process along much more quickly. Again, funders see it as increasing visibility. They're able to reuse their information or the data that they're generating from their funding. So again, they get a greater return on investment. In terms of the public aspect of it, there would be again increased transparency. You get better engagement, and organizations and national governments then will again get access to more information and can make more data-driven decisions. I mentioned this term on previous slides, but just to go into it in a bit more detail, and it's this term called FAIR data management, or the FAIR principles. So the FAIR principles really are just to kind of represent a set of guidelines designed to kind of enhance the findability, the accessibility, the interoperability, and the reusability of digital assets and data. So what they're intended really to do is to improve the overall management and utilization of the data and research, making it easier, we'd say, for individuals and organizations to discover, maybe access and utilize information more effectively. So again, the acronym itself stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And they're really instrumental in terms of modern data management, and they're promoting really a standardized and more efficient approach to handling and utilizing data across various disciplines, not necessarily just medicine. So following these kind of principles then, I suppose, really kind of fosters a data sharing culture that can benefit not only the individual research but also the scientific community, we'd say, as a whole. So if we take a look at the principles and practices in and around FAIR data, so the first one is the findable. So what do we mean by that? And that just means that our data and our metadata should easily be locatable and accessible. So the principle really emphasizes the importance of using rich kind of metadata, data dictionaries, assigning kind of different identifiers like digital object identifiers when we're publishing our papers, and ensuring proper indexing so that data can be easily found by both humans and machines. The A, as we said, is accessible. So again, data should be readily available for users, which means it should be easily, downloadable or retrievable. And accessibility involves clear permissions, and we'll say, and usage licenses. And again, that should be very clear from our publishers as well, ensuring that access to data without any kind of undue barriers, we'll say. Interoperable then means that you should be able to use it across different platforms and disciplines, and so this involves again using kind of standards and formats that promote compatibility really, and that would enable, we'll say, seamless integration with other data sources. So compatibility again is crucial for effective data integration and analysis, and that's particularly important if you're using specific software, we'll say, to analyze samples in the lab, that you would be able to transfer that information into a more readable format. So reusable, again, data should be constructed in a way that makes it easy to understand, interpret and reuse, and again it emphasizes that need really for clear and comprehensive metadata documentation, ensuring that everyone knows what the variables mean, what the various different constructs what coding you're using, again, and giving some kind of contextual information if you can possibly facilitate that to ensure that that is effectively reused essentially. There are a number of different reasons to really aim for FAIR data and or open data. So one of them obviously is you'll expose your data and your research to a wider audience. People will be able to get more access to it, and that'll increase transparency, and it'll allow your results to be reproduced at other sites, which is important. It'll also reduce the duplication of effort. So again, you will be able to access other people's information, and you will be able to move along the process much more quickly. And it will increase the longevity, obviously, of your data as well if it's being utilized for multiple different sites. You'll be able to share the null results, and it'll also offer up opportunities for new partnerships and collaborations. And in the meantime, you'll save time and effort in terms of maintaining your own database as well. And it certainly offers better value for public money spent on research. So again, similar to data management plans, there's a number of grants funders that are insisting now at looking at FAIR data and FAIR data principles. So again, the HRB, as I've mentioned before, Horizon 2020, the Irish Research Council, SFI, etc., all looking towards utilising FAIR data principles. And also our publication houses now are looking at FAIR principles in terms of publication. So again, something to consider long term for your own research activity. So we're going to pivot again now and move away from data management and look at the final part of our session, which is regulatory reporting. And again, this is going to be a very brief overview because there's an awful lot involved in pharmacovigilance. So I'm just going to briefly mention protocol deviation and serious breaches, and just mention briefly terms like adverse events, serious adverse events, and SUSARs. So the first thing we'll have a look at are protocol deviations, and they can happen sometimes in our clinical trial or the conduct of our clinical trial. So again, an example of a protocol deviation would be something like, we'll say, a patient visit outside of a specified window. Maybe they're gone on annual leave and you miss a specific visit, or there's no bloods, we'll say, taken at a specific time frame. So again, you would inform the PI at the site, and you would record in a deviation log or deviation form. And those kind of processes or procedures would be outlined by the sponsor or the monitor of that specific study. You may classify those then as major or minor depending, and the sponsor may wish to see major deviations, we'll say, within a certain time frame, and again they would define that. But in general, the monitor would look at those deviations at a monitoring visit, or you may be in contact with the monitor on a more frequent time frame. So again, they would have a kind of corrective action in place and a preventative action plan in place, and that would be documented, we'd say, in your site file. So then if we take a kind of more broad look at serious breaches and what would we consider a serious breach. And so a serious breach is a breach, we'll say, that is likely to have a significant effect on either the safety or the rights of the subject, or the reliability and robustness of the data generated in the clinical trial. So we're looking at things like a patient was given the wrong amount of a drug, we'll say, if there's suspicion of some kind of a clinical trial fraud, maybe failure to manage safety events, for example, not reporting SUSARs in a specific time period, etc. So those would be kind of more serious breaches, or examples of serious breaches. So you need to report any kind of serious breach, that is anything that would affect the clinical trials regulations or the version of the protocol applicable at the time of the breach. So in terms of the role of the PI then on the site in terms of serious breaches, and the investigator, the third party or the vendor involved will usually have a process in place to identify and notify the sponsor of any kind of occurrence of a serious breach. So it could be a formal SOP, it could be outlined in the protocol, or it could be a study specific guidance. So again, you would report those to the sponsor, and the sponsor then would have a kind of a root cause analysis and a CAPA associated with those, and they may need to be reported, we'll say, to the regulatory authority, or to via the system, the central CTIS system in the EU now. And again, they would have to be reported within a specific time frame, so usually within 7 days of the sponsor being becoming aware, we'll say, of the breach itself. So again, there's a number of different terms involved in reporting of safety in clinical trials. And again, the sponsor will outline exactly what processes are involved for reporting of these various different events. So one of them is a thing called an adverse event, and that's any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical trial subject administered an IMP, which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with the treatment. And again, the sponsor would be very clear on how to deal with those. An adverse reaction, again, there's a reasonable possibility this time that there is some kind of a causal relationship between the event and the drug itself. And then we have a clear definition of a serious adverse event, so that needs to meet specific serious criteria, and that criteria could be death, life-threatening, prolongation of hospitalization, disability, incapacity, congenital abnormality, or birth defect, or any other important medical event. And again, the sponsor would have a very clear process involved for the site of how to alert them to those specific events. And that could be an email, it could be a specific form that you need to submit, or it could be, again, part of the electronic system that would be inputted by the principal investigator, we'll say, at site, and reviewed by the sponsor or the monitor centrally. And again, they would have specific process internally and how to deal with those events. Then finally, we've got a thing called SUSAR reporting, and a SUSAR is a suspected unexpected serious adverse event. And again, that's more subject to regulatory reporting requirements, and there's a kind of an expedited reporting system in place. So SUSARs themselves would be submitted electronically to the competent authority and or a system called the EU Vigilance System database in the EMA. And again, there's specific timelines in and around those. So if it's fatal or life-threatening, that would be within 7 days, and all others would be in and around 15 days. And the HPA themselves can agree by prior arrangement to submit these reports to the EU Vigilance System on behalf of, we'll say, academic sponsors who may not have the supports in place that a commercial study would have. So again, the sponsor would be very clear and outline the procedures involved in that from the offset of reporting of SUSARs. So I've come to the end of the session now, and I'm very happy to take any questions you may have, or feel free to email me after the session at e.flanagan@ucc.ie.